And isn't that cool? Can I tell a real quick story? I'll make it real quick. But you guys know the problems we've had here at this house. Between this house and the one next door, there's a natural it's sort of like a ditch, but there's a natural place where water runs off. And I channeled some of our backyard into that so it would run off and not get trapped by the driveway. The lady next door had people come this week and fill it in. She spent money on dirt and workers to fill in a ditch for no reason other than to harm us. And I didn't mention this before, but I said something to her. I said, that could make my house flood. And her response is, I know it sounds unbelievable, I don't care. And, I don't know how someone gets, I should have mentioned her in our prayers. I don't know how someone, no, I really should have. I'm not joking. I know people laugh, but I'm real serious. I don't know how someone gets that miserable and hateful, but it's got to be a horrible way to live. It really does. And I talk about where Jesus talks about a life more abundant. That's not it. That's not it. And to live that way has got to just be like a daily torture exercise. So it was one of the meanest things I've ever seen done. Second only to something Mary's mother did one time that I'll tell another day. But it's just pure spite. And she spent money to harm another person. So I don't know. We'll have to find another way to drain that portion of the yard.
We'll drain it this way.
We'll drain it this way. So let's go.
Okay, Acts 16, and we left off last week. We're at verse 25, but just to catch everybody up, Paul, in the name of Jesus, asked that an evil spirit leave the slave girl, she was a fortune teller, and the evil spirit left the slave girl, and those that were making money off of her complained, and they complained to the officials saying, quote, "These men are Jews and are throwing our city into turmoil by promoting customs that are unlawful for us Romans to adopt or practice." And as a result of that, which is, first of all, is not what Paul and Silas were doing, but anyhow, that's what they claimed. And Paul and Silas were taken by the officials. They were beaten and thrown into jail. And the last time we left them, they had been shackled, their feet put into these stocks. And so that's where we left off. I'm going to start with Acts 16, verse 25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, a strong earthquake shook the foundation of the prison. At once, all the doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. When the jailer woke up and saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, presuming that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul called out in a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself. We are all here." Calling for lights, the jailer rushed in and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Then Paul and Silas spoke the word of the Lord to him and to everyone in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer who took them and washed their wounds, and without delay, he and all his household were baptized. Then he brought them into his home and set a meal before them. So he and all his households rejoiced, and they came to believe in God.
Yay, that last part. So the idea of the jail being shaken, the chains being unloosed, I've talked before that these Roman jailers are they're charged with keeping prisoners, and if they lose one of them, one of these people that are that important, the jailer gets killed. And a lot of the time, him and his entire family can and will be killed as a result. And there are a bunch of reasons for it, from politics, the policy probably makes sense. The jailer's not required to keep them in the jail. He can take them with him. He can do whatever. But if he loses them, his life is forfeit. And we
read another story in Acts where when the angel let him out, that's what happened.
We see that happened with Peter, and the jailers killed themselves. They fell on their swords. The idea there being they're hopeful that protects the rest of their family by accepting that, by doing that they won't go punish the family. It's that serious. And I've talked about it a lot of times, but here's an example of it. And the things are, the jail is shaken, the doors are open, it's dark, and the jailer is about, it says he's going to kill himself. And Paul yells out, "Don't harm yourself." We should back up. There is this issue of them being in jail in stocks. And I tried to make this clear last year. The legs are actually raised up because of the stocks. So your tendency is to lay down, because if you sit up, it's like doing crunches. It's like doing if you set up for 8 hours, it would be like doing 8 hours worth of crunches, those stomach exercises. They're not intended to be fun. And here's Paul and Silas singing. And what you see from that is not so much that they're willing to sing, which is a big deal. They're singing, but the example that we give, the example that we can be, and it says that people, the other prisoners noticed this. Mary, you want to talk about your friend?
Well, and I had told that story before but a story that I have told before, that my friend Cheryl, who I took Bible study with, and we were good acquaintances at best, and she had cancer. She always said she had 9 lives, and it was her 9th one. She knew this time that she wasn't going to make it, and and this was early on in my Bible study career, if you will, and she had asked me through another member of the Bible study to come visit her. And I did. This is when we lived in San Antonio. And this is a lady, the one who didn't have the perfect life. She was estranged from her daughter. Her husband had Alzheimer's, and now she was dying. But I went into her bedroom and to visit with her, and the peace and the joy, and I don't know, as Scott and I were talking about yesterday, I mean, it has had a lifetime effect on me. She just welcomed me into a room, and I don't know if she was in pain or not, but if she was in pain, God was definitely giving her the grace to live with it. But she was just beautiful, and she looked beautiful. And this is someone who had cancer reoccurring so many times in her life that from a body standpoint, it had taken everything out of her. But, and I think I told you, she was not reading the Bible, she was reading People's Magazine. And I said, People's Magazine? And she says, I've read the Bible for years, and I know I'm about to get to talk to Jesus firsthand, and there's a couple stories I want to read in People. But her big thing was, I just wanted to say, I know I'm going to see you again, and I'm okay. And just the effect that had on me to know that God's grace can really get you. And like you said, that's the lesson of Paul and Silas leaning back, singing in a jail after being beaten. What that must have done to those who had
I'm almost, certain it's the first time anyone had ever heard singing coming from those jail cells. And it does speak to people around us. But we see this thing happen. We see the jailer who's about to kill himself, and Paul yells out, "Don't harm yourself. We're still here." That also is unthinkable to this jailer, and he asks this question, "What must I do to be saved?" Gene, we talked ahead last week, and Gene said, "What do you think he was really asking?" I've asked myself that a lot of times. Is he speaking in the sense of becoming right with God? Is he speaking in being, saved from some? We really don't know. Paul's answer is immediate and definite.
Believe,
and you'll be saved. And then we move to this. The jailer takes them to his home, and a lot of people may think that's strange when you're on the hook, but he has that right. Nobody would question him taking. He has the ability to do that. They always do. They rarely do because they're on the hook if they get loose. But he knows now that they're not going to try and escape, and he takes them to his home. He cleans them up, and it says that he understands. They explain to him. He believes, and he's baptized. And then it says, and his whole family. Here's another one of those things.
And going back, the two things to listen to, first of all, when Paul and Silas tell them, it says, they replied, believe in Jesus Christ and you will be saved, you and your household.
You and your household, yeah.
Right, and
thanks.
then it says, and without delay, all his household were baptized.
This is one of those, you would think it seems so simple, but it winds up being the root of a lot of controversy, a lot of discussion. We don't know if that means if the whole family believes. There are people who say that because he does, he can get his whole family baptized and they're taken care of. I've got no answer for that. It doesn't seem consistent to me, and it doesn't agree with the way I've read things. But now we started in Acts, and I made a whole bunch of people mad when I brought up the subject of infant baptism. And people took it, the way that they were wired to take it. I see the idea of belief first and then baptism, but I had to write some people and tell them, look, I'm not trying to jump on you. I don't understand some of these things. I personally see belief first and then baptism. But here we have this thing that says you believe and you'll be saved, you and your whole household. And that's one of the arguments people make, saying that's why we do infant baptism. And I will not try and shout down somebody who looks at this and says that. I can't. It's not consistent with what I see, but it's going to surprise some of you to hear me say, I simply am not given enough information for me to talk over the top and shout down somebody and say, no, that's not it.
Well, and two things that are interesting. This is like, if you look at different denominations' beliefs in infants versus adult baptism, this is the section that this and Lydia that we just finished when her household was baptized, this is one of the things that they say, the reason for infant baptism. And the other interesting thing here is immersion is another big thing. I just thought about this when I was reading it. There are denominations who believe the only way for proper baptism is to be immersed. I'm thinking to myself, in the middle of the night in a jailer's home, immersion was probably not happening. But anyhow, it's just funny, all the rules that people come up with, and we don't know.
So what I will say on the subject is this. If the goal is to say, okay, I'm covered, I get to go to heaven when I die, I can do anything I want to. If you want to, fill up a ditch to harm the person next door because your parents took care of you when you were little and now I've got nothing to worry about. If your goal is to live like that, then certainly this is comforting. But what we're looking for is this idea of being disciples and this idea of having a life more abundant. And regardless of the jailer, if his whole household is somehow covered because of his action, we're still missing the point. Because the point of this is what happens afterwards. What we do in this world. Carol, your brows are knitted. Have I said something offensive?
No, can't see you.
Oh, okay. Can't see me, all right. But I think this is where these arguments over things like infant baptism or you and your whole household ignore the more important point. And that is, what we do here matters. And if we believe ourselves, it seems that it changes us and it changes our lives. And that's important. It's very important. So that's all I really, unless you've got something else, that's all I have to say about that. This thing about you and your whole household is one of those subjects that make us argue with each other. Yes, sir.
I think even Jeremiah says, but for me and my household, I will follow the Lord. That
Yeah.
phrase is, I guess, from the paternal side, I am them and they are me, and I'm responsible for them and they're responsible to me. But that sidetrack.
No, it's an interesting point, and it's one of my favorite places in the Bible. It was Joshua, but they're about to cross in, and he tells all these people, because they've fallen back into worshiping these local pagan gods, these idols, and he calls them together, and he says, you choose this day who you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now, he sort of speaks for them, but he can't speak for their heart. He can tell them, you're part of, in that society, you're part of my household, and you will be, you'll be doing all the sacrifices, but he can't speak for their heart. And that's at the root of this other discussion, is regardless of what someone else does in terms of baptism, infant baptism, or this thing that the jailer does, they can't change your heart. Your own belief. That's why we have confirmation, because that's the point where these kids are supposed to decide to make faith their own, and a lot of the time they're still herded through like sheep. You're responsible for your own heart. That much I think is undeniable. This other stuff, I'm just not going to get into a shouting match with anybody over. I can tell you what I read, but no one else can change your heart for you. So.
And in that, it says, the last sentence here on 34 is, so he and all his household rejoiced that they had come to believe in God. And that's the important part.
Thank you, because I had left that off, and that is absolutely right. And we're told, and there's Luke once again, when we have things, a lot of the time it's because we ignore things. Luke gives us most of the time the information that we need. He and his whole household rejoiced that they had come to believe in God. And Luke's telling us they believed. That's good enough for me. The rest of it I'll leave to you.
Let me digress to the girl, the soothsayer that they arrested him from. The Jews come in and they say, these men are, that's 19, these men are Jews and are throwing our city in turmoil. This is 50 years plus, right? So are they not yet Christians or followers of the way? Are they still Jews?
As you do, you sort of jumped ahead of me, but yes, it's an interesting thing, and it's worth noting that at this point, most people see what we call Christianity, what at that point they're referring to as the way, as simply another sect of Judaism. That's a fact. And within the Jewish community, there's still this idea that this is just another sect of Judaism. The idea that Gentiles are being brought in is not universally understood or accepted. So yeah, they see them simply as Jews. And, it's probably, since we covered that, and if you'll forgive me, but these things they sit hard on people. This girl who they say is possessed by a spirit. And most people in this time tend to reject those things. I believe things that I can touch and see and measure with science. That particular scripture of Paul and Silas being in jail, and they're singing, and there's the ground is shaken, the gates open, these shackles are thrown off, and I even hear ministers talk about it like just a natural occurrence, just a fortuitous earthquake, natural event. And so I'm going to tell you a story. You don't want to digress. I'm going to tell you a story. We were in a church. The minister talks about this, teaches about, and one of the things that the minister says is, Isn't it a great thing that we have a God who breaks down walls? And that's a wonderful thought, the God that breaks down walls for us. And I'm sitting there with Mary and these 3 little stair-step children, and someone says to me, "That's great unless you happen to be the wall." And I look around and I'm thinking, like, Mary, and I realize I can't describe this to any of you in any better terms, because I heard it, but I didn't hear it. And I realized nobody else heard it. But not only that, I didn't even know what that meant. I'm looking around going, what does that even mean? This is not a normal occurrence. And it took some time that day for me sitting and just, going over this to realize the message for me was that very often we are the wall. We've created the thing that has us in prison in our lives. We've done through our own, and if you're the cause of, if you've made decisions and you're the wall, when it gets broken down, it hurts. It's a great thing when God breaks down the wall, except that a lot of the time we pray and we say, "God, get me out of this jam." And the thing is, in order to get you out of that jam, it's going to hurt. I've experienced that firsthand several times of things that were terrible in my life, and it was the only way to get me out of the jail that I was in. Now, Robin Williams said, if you talk to God, you're religious. If God talks to you, you're schizophrenic. I'm telling you what I heard. And so when I tell you that I believe there is more to this place than meets the eye, and that this woman, I have no problem believing that the account we have, that she has a spirit, it doesn't offend me at all. I don't have any problem accepting that as it's written. A lot of people and a lot of believers say, well, they just didn't understand psychology and this and all that kind of stuff. And I can't, again, I'm not going to shout you down on that, but I'm going to tell you, for me, I know from firsthand that there is more to this place than meets the eye. So, that's deeper than I had intended to go. But when we read these things and don't resolve the issues, and we hear about this girl and we don't actually come out and talk about it, people are left with doubts in their mind. All I can tell you is I have no doubts personally. And if you do, maybe that helps, maybe it doesn't, but you know where I stand on it. Can we go now?
Yes. Verse 35. When daylight came, the magistrates sent their officers with the order, "Release those men." The jailer informed Paul, "The magistrates have sent orders to release you. Now you may go on your way in peace." But Paul said to the officers, "They beat us publicly without a trial and threw us into prison, even though we are Roman citizens. And now do they want to send us away secretly? Absolutely not. Let them come themselves and escort them out." So the officers relayed the message to the magistrates, who were alarmed to hear that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens. They came to appease them and led them out, requesting that they leave the city. After Paul and Silas came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house to see the brothers and encourage them. Then they left the city.
So this is one of those things that gets abused and beaten around, and there are a lot of people who are offended that Paul is haughty. Paul pulls out his Roman citizen card and beats somebody with it. They've been beaten publicly, humiliated, thrown in jail overnight, and then they send people down from the magistrates, from the higher ups, with instructions to let them out. This is not an uncommon thing. Pilate has Jesus beaten and says, "Now that I've beaten him, let's just let him go," right? And they would do this to people on a whim, and they would beat them half to death and then let them go and say, "Now you should be grateful that it wasn't worse." So it's not an uncommon thing. And they send these soldiers, messengers, to say, "Let them go and tell them to get out of town." And Paul pops up and says, "Yeah, no, I'm a Roman citizen, And you
And
guys.
so is Silas,
And so is
remember?
Silas, yeah, that's true. That came up earlier and it was important. I'm a Roman citizen. You're not going to get rid of me that easily. You tell them they have to come down here themselves and apologize to me in person. And that sounds like this aggressive, haughty thing that Paul is doing.
Or on the other hand, when I read it, I think to myself, what was wrong with Paul? Why didn't he do it before they beat him up?
Well, and we'll get to
Yeah.
that. So I mentioned before, and these things are mentioned for a reason, that other people, when they get tried differently than Roman citizens. They have much fewer rights, and they often are just abused by these tribunals. They can be beaten at will, but you don't beat a Roman citizen. You don't publicly humiliate a Roman citizen, especially not without a trial. And if someone does that, now I'm telling you, this is true. It happened a few times where someone gets out of line and punishes and humiliates a Roman citizen without a trial, and they're killed for their trouble. And if they're not killed, they're punished severely. Their life is ruined. You're not allowed to do this. You're allowed to do it to non-Romans. You can get by with anything other than executing them. But you can't do this to Roman citizens. They have a right to a trial, and their trial is handled much differently. They have rights that other people don't have. Now, Paul knows this, and this is the point I want to make, because I've had people talk about, and I read a lot of this, how Paul, he believes in God, but when he needs to, he pulls out his Roman citizenship. He uses that like to protect him. And you notice that Paul and Silas don't do that before the beating. They're smart enough to know, as Roman citizens, all they have to do is say the word, and this won't happen. It just won't happen. And instead, they allow themselves to be beaten, humiliated, and stuck in jail. When these people hear it, it says that the magistrates were very dismayed to hear that these are Roman citizens, because they know they're in trouble. And Paul says, you tell them to come down here and apologize to us in person. And you think, wow, what a haughty thing to do. He could have done that to begin with. Here's the thing. There are these new believers in town. And if you remember to the beginning of this, they're out by the river. There appears to be no synagogue. There are not a lot of people on their side in this town. And Paul knows that if he tucks tail and leaves town, those people are vulnerable. Those people, they know they've been hanging out with Paul. They probably have seen them get baptized. They're in trouble. And Paul knows this nascent church, and we throw that word church around loosely, but this nascent church is at risk. These people will be singled out. So the magistrates come down, they apologize, and they go, look, they appease them. And then they say, but would you just get out of town before you stir things up again? And what does Paul do? The first thing he does, he doesn't leave town. He heads straight to Lydia's house. Why? It's because his goal is to protect them. And what he's done by putting this little scene together is he's established that he's a Roman citizen, and if I leave and you punish them, it's because of me. And so he stages this whole thing to protect Lydia and her household and all of the other believers, that small group. And he does this several times. He's looking out for, and so it says he goes to Lydia's house and checks in and strengthens the believers, and then he leaves town. So he sees to them that they're not going to get singled out and punished after he leaves.
And remember, this is Philippi, and we know that the Philippian church becomes a strong church. Becomes a strong group of believers, and he continues to encourage them, etc. We're going to see a city where that is not the case, but this is.
This is not Paul flexing his Roman muscles. This is Paul doing what he can to protect these young believers, because he is going to leave. He's going to move on to the next place.
And that's, as we continue to study Paul and as we go on to the next thing, you will see Paul has he has a lot of equipment, and he uses different tools in different places. And this is where he used the Roman tool to help the church. It wasn't to help him, it was to help the body of believers. And that's what he does over and over again. And he does things different depending on who he's talking to. Not because he's two-sided, but because he's trying to
And
grow
not
the
because
church.
he doesn't trust God, but because he has this ability to do this, and he does.
Okay, I am going to.
We know that we have a Jewish community with their own rules.
Yes,
Then we know we have the Romans with their own rules.
yes.
And these guys are Jews, Germans versus Germans, Jews telling about other Jews.
Which are the new believers that gets Paul and Timothy in trouble and get sent. How come they don't go to the root of the problem, which are the complainers that gets them to the magistrate and into the Roman hands? Now he's concerned about the Romans who are going to be executing whatever revenge they got, but I think only agitated by the fellow Jews.
I'll make you a deal. Let me get back to that in just a little bit, because
Okay.
that's what you do. You like to, you see the things ahead of time, but we're going to talk about it.
So I brought up the Paul's second missionary journey again, because we're in the middle of it, and I will share another screen that gives you mileage. But what I learned, this entire path is 2,700 miles, just to give you an idea. We're right now in Philippi, and I just want to let you know we're going to go to, how do you say these cities? Amphipolis? Yes.
Amphipolis, yeah.
And
Or Amphipolis, I'm sorry. Amphipolis and Apollonia. Apollonia is an easy one. Amphipolis is a strange one.
And then we're going to go to Thessalonica, and then we're going to go to Berea and to Athens. That's going to take us, that is basically chapter 17. But I wanted to give you an idea of where we were. This is all land travel and part of the Paul's second missionary journey. I'm going to stop sharing. Do you have anything about that map you want to say?
No, except that we have come to realize we're not on the receiving end of Zoom. And for a lot of you, these maps are not large. So I've decided this week, I think we should email copies of the maps just so that some of you can see it in large size if you want to. It is amazing, 2,700 miles, by foot, with occasional ship journeys. Paul was pretty dedicated.
Chapter 17, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbaths he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. "This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is Christ," he declared. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few leading women. The Jews, however, became jealous, so they brought in some troublemakers from the marketplace, formed a mob, and set the city into an uproar. They raided Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas, hoping to bring them out to the people. But when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some other brothers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king named Jesus." On hearing this, the crowd and city officials were greatly disturbed, and they collected bond from Jason and the others, and then released them. One of the things I'm going to point out before I turn it over to Scott is you'll notice that at the end of chapter 16 and at the beginning of chapter 17, it says, "Then they left the city when they had passed through." So remember, Luke was with them for a while. Luke is not with them again. So we went from having Paul, Silas, Timothy, the young new guy who's with them, and Luke. He was with them in chapter 16. Now Luke has either stayed in Philippi, the thought is he probably stayed in Philippi, and we'll go back to we again. But once again, now it's the party of 3 leaders, not 4.
He goes from they to we and back to they. And it's an indication that Luke stayed somewhere along the way, probably to help these group of new believers. And so what we see is Paul and Silas stay in the house of Jason, and the locals, as they tend to, they get very angry at them. Oh, they're stirring people up. They're saying something that we don't like. And I know sometimes it sounds like I'm just railing on the Jewish community. I'm really not, because we see this exact same thing today. You say something and people don't like it, we've gotten in a habit of trying to stop people from saying things that we don't like. That's all that's going on. You're doing something that threatens us, so we're going to stop you. And they go looking for Paul and Silas and Timothy, and they can't find them. But they know where they've been staying. They've been staying in Jason's house.
And then aside on Jason's house, so I think, and who's Jason? This is the first we've heard of Jason. So I decided to go on a rabbit hole thing on, what do we know about Jason? And there's all these things out there that we basically know nothing about Jason, and there's one group of people that say we know nothing about Jason, but we know he's a Greek because that's a Greek name. And then there's a whole bunch of other people that say we know nothing about Jason, but Jason is a Jew because at this time they used the name Jason for Jews to be accepted. I mean, I'm thinking to myself, the only thing we are in agreement of is we know nothing about Jason.
and if you go doing some of this on your own and you happen to encounter the first one and you don't see the second one, people speak with just great certainty. Here's what you should know about that. I thought it was a great story when Mary told me of that. She finds one authority that says absolutely he's a Greek. And then she reads this other one that says absolutely he's a Jew. Before, when we talked about Timothy, Luke tells us about Timothy's parentage because it's important, because it ties into this thing of being circumcised. Luke tells us what we need to know. I keep telling you this. Luke is real good about it. He tells us what we need to know, and he says it straight out. So he tells us about Timothy's parentage. He tells us nothing about Jason's parentage. Why? It's not important. And yet there are these people who take it on themselves to go, tell these whole narratives about it. So let's go back to the other point, and that is this. They're looking for Paul and Silas. They want to punish them, as they do. They can't find them. I don't know why. So instead, they pick up the guy whose house they've been staying at and haul him down, and he's in trouble. Now go back to what I just told you about Paul playing the Roman citizen card. It's not only it's not unthinkable that those other people would have been punished because of Paul and Silas, it's almost certain that they would have been. And you see the same thing play out at their next stop on the journey. This guy whose house they've been staying at gets hauled in, and he gets in trouble, and they don't exactly fine him. It's sort of like a surety bond, but they take money from him, and it says if you keep participating in this, your money is forfeit. But it's a punishment, and they'll do worse things to him.
Okay.
Again, that's the Jews.
It's not the Romans.
No, but the Romans are capable in their own way. You notice what the story they come up with is, they say he's teaching something that threatens Caesar. He's teaching that there's another king. So they've gone to the Romans. They've gone to the Romans because the story they tell is one designed to get the Romans involved. He's out here teaching that there's another king besides Caesar. That's how they go to get the Romans on their side. Is it the Jews? Yes. But I've realized that in past weeks, I may have come across as if I'm anti-Jew, and I am not even remotely so. You just have to deal with the facts. This community, this Jewish community, sees using Jesus, Yeshua, and saying that he's the Messiah as a threat. Go ahead.
But that's been decided in the trial.
Jesus tried. I am a king, but not of this world.
Yeah, that was a Roman trial. Let's go, since we're talking about the Jews, let's talk about the Jews. And I might as well throw this in. At one point, Paul preaches from Isaiah 53. And it's what's known as the suffering servant. It is this idea that Messiah, when Messiah comes, he'll be humble, he'll be lowly, he will be abused, he will be, treated badly, he will suffer. And it was accepted within Judaism, within the synagogues, that this is a messianic prophecy, that Isaiah 53 prophesies about the Messiah. But when Jesus comes along and these disciples are saying, look, this Isaiah 53, look how it agrees with what happened with Jesus, and they went nuts. All right? We don't want this guy that got killed to be the Messiah. And I'm going to tell you the truth, and you've got to, you can look it up. But what they started doing was simply eliminating Isaiah 53. It was too difficult. They were having these debates, and people like Paul were often winning the debates. And so they just eliminated, and it's actually the last half of 52 and all of 53 in the synagogues, they get up to this certain point and they stop. And then the next week when you come back, they're on 54. They eliminated Isaiah 53 because they didn't like that people were saying this points to this Yeshua, this Jesus, as the Messiah. And there are a lot of places today, synagogues, that just don't bother with Isaiah 53. So it's the Jews, but I think we're in danger of pointing at them and saying it's because they're Jews. That's a mistake. It's because people love power. They crave it. And this, in this case, threatened their power structure. And so they're actually following Paul around. We'll see several times that he leaves one city, goes to the next one, and the people from the last city follow him over and stir them up and say, hey.
I don't think that it is the Jews that are at fault. I think we're missing the point when we have Luke here say about Lydia was granted grace to believe.
Yes.
That's the point, because we hear some Jews converted, some didn't by Paul's persuasion, some didn't. So here is this power of God coming to the individual. You believe, you're baptized, so you're saved. Boom. And you follow the law, the Roman law or the Old Testament law, the old Jewish, is not going to get you to where you believe. You have to get the grace to be able to believe.
Gene, and I hope the rest of you don't mind, but since this gets beaten about so much, there are people who believe that and it comes down to predestination, that only people who are given special dispensation by God believe, and the other ones cannot. And unfortunately, that leads us into this idea of predestination. And I was asked to be an elder in a church, and I said, okay, what do I have to believe? What do I have to say? Well, one thing that they believed in was predestination. And I said, I respectfully decline. I can't do that. And this minister and I went back and forth, as always happens. All right.
This is in San Antonio.
This is in San Antonio, yeah. And I just said, look, I don't, and he, he's just hammering away at me. So I'm going to tell you my perspective on predestination. What I told him was, every Sunday he did a children's time. And all the little kids come up and he does a little children's message for about 3 minutes. And all of these bright little faces look up at him. And I said, next week, when those little children come up, I want you to look out in those little faces and tell them, some of you have been pre-chosen to go to heaven, and some of you statistically have been pre-chosen to go to hell. And there's nothing you can do about it because you're not chosen. If you will look out and say that with all of their parents sitting behind them, then I will consider what you're saying. And if you don't, then you're not real committed, because that's what that means. So this idea of being given the grace, I believe that we are all given the grace, that the plan was that no one would be lost, that Jesus' intent, that the whole point of Mashiach was not just Jews, it's Jews, Gentiles, and it's everyone. And that puts upon us a responsibility to tell others. But I refuse to get into a discussion that leads us towards the idea that some people, some of those little children, are predestined for eternal separation from God, and they have no say in it. They have no ability. I just won't go there, and that's all I'm going to say about that. And I know
And
what
he's a nightmare for ministers, just so you know.
Yeah.
He's an absolute nightmare.
and we keep getting off in this. Acts leads itself to that, but these are things that
No.
separate us as Christians.
But
And
it's important to understand.
I think we have to talk
Yeah.
about them.
So we're on to one of what I think is just a great passage. And for those of you, you know that we use the Berean Bible, and some of you have gotten the Berean Study Bible, and it is a new translation in the fact that it's just come out in paper form. But
It's named, we're about to read about the people it's named after.
So verse 10, as soon as night had fallen, the brothers had sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went into a Jewish synagogue. Now the Bereans were more noble-minded than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if these teachings were true. As a result, many of them believed, along with quite a few prominent Greek women and men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that Paul was also proclaiming the word of God in Berea, they went there themselves to incite and agitate the crowds. The brothers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy remained in Berea. Those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens, and then returned with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join them as soon as possible.
So here's Luke. We use the word noble in the translation, but the Bereans readily accepted this message that Paul and Silas, or at least they gave it a shot. And it says that they examined the scriptures every day to see if these words were true, to see if they hold water. I mean, does it make sense or not? And they checked it out for themselves rather than just being told. These people dug into the scriptures and said, I want to know whether this is true or not. And that's why when they came out with this translation of the Bible that I like so much, Mary and I like so much, they named it the Berean Study Bible. It's named after these people. And it says that a lot of people in Berea came to believe. It was what we think of as a fertile field, but the people were open to looking at the scriptures and seeing if what Paul and Silas say makes sense, where a lot of the other people in other places are closed to it. We don't want to hear that. We're not even going to consider it. And that's when Luke says they were more noble-minded, that's what he means, is that they were willing to consider that something that might challenge them could still be true, and they examined for themselves. And here's an example of the thing I just got through telling you. The people from Philippi who had run, caused all this trouble, they hear Paul's going up the road to Berea, Thessalonica, and they follow him. It's not enough that we punished you in our city. We don't want you spreading this heresy anyplace else, because then it might filter back to us anyway. So they followed him to the next place to stir up the crowds, and it's always the same trick. You get the mob going. Oh, these people are, and people, unfortunately.
And it's 50 miles from Thessalonica to Berea. It's like, it's not next door, guys. They went 50 miles to cause this trouble.
On foot. They filled in the ditch next door to harm someone. They went to trouble and expense just to harm someone. Yeah.
You know,
If those Jews believed, then they're doing the same thing. They're being disciples. They're preaching their whole law. Right? If their motive is corrupt, that's a whole different story. But that's exactly what Paul is doing. He said, I've got to stop you for religious reasons, not for political reasons. If the Jews have corrupt motives, then it is political. It's not religious.
Okay, but what Paul's method is because the Jews are familiar with the scriptures, it tells us Paul goes into the synagogues and he teaches logically. He goes down because they know the scriptures, that's effective with them. But he says, here I'm presenting to you these things that I say are truth. They still have the right to believe or not to believe. The difference is these other people say, oh, we don't really like you saying that. We'd like to have you killed. Now, there's a difference there between those two things. And I think it's always important for us to understand what is important to us today. What do we learn from the scriptures about our own lives? And if that's not an example, we see this often today. We used to hear back in the 60s and 70s and 80s on TV, there would be things that they were starting to show things that people found objectionable. And what we were told is, if you don't like it, change the channel. If you don't like it, turn the television off. Now, those same people who have got control on the other side are saying, we don't like what you're saying, and we're going to have you taken off the air. We're going to have you canceled. We're going to take away your ability to deposit money in a bank account. There's nothing new under the sun. And we see this going on today. Unfortunately, I see a lot of Christian people who say, who profess faith, who want people who say objectionable things shut down. And this is going on in the year 54 AD or whatever it is by this point. They don't like what Paul and Silas are saying, and they're gonna see to it that they don't get the opportunity to say it, even to the point of the one time stoning Paul until they think he's dead, and they drag his limp body out of town. I think we're going to see more of that. We are certainly seeing it in other countries where we've taken for granted our ability to maintain our faith and to profess our faith. And I am utterly certain we will see more restrictions on our ability to do that or face sanctions of some kind. We're seeing nothing different then than what we see today.
I mean, we're going to probably just be able to introduce this next session, if that's okay. Paul brought him to Athens. So Silas and Timothy stay in Berea, and those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens and then returned with instructions for Silas and Paul to join him as soon as possible. So Silas and Timothy are to go to Athens in a little while, right? Paul goes to Athens by himself. He is dropped off there. They transport him there, but he is there by himself, which is interesting. I'm just going to read this first section. Is that okay?
What you guys don't see is that down below here, Mary is tapping me on the leg saying, you've talked too much about this. We have to move on.
Do you want me to stop here?
No, let's go.
While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply disturbed in his spirit to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace with those he met each day. Some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others said, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was proclaiming the good news of Jesus and the resurrection. So they took Paul and brought him to the Areopagus, where they asked him, May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting, for you are bringing some strange notions to our ears, and we want you to know what they mean. Now all the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing more than hearing and articulating new ideas. So this is sort of a tease for next week.
For next week, if you get a chance to read ahead, I recommend it. They mention the Epicureans and the Stoics. And those of you who are really diligent and curious, go out and do a search on Epicureanism and Stoicism. It is important to church today, but it was very important then, and it was all centered in Athens. Those things were created, those philosophies were created in Athens, both around 300 BC, so they'd had time to really take root. 300 years is older than our country. And so these thoughts have been around, and they permeate. And so Athens is this cauldron of philosophy. Keep in mind, Paul left and went by himself. We'll talk about that next week. Why? I mean, going by himself is a little odd, but Paul's the lightning rod, and so he clears out to keep everybody from being punished for his sake. But Timothy and Silas stay behind, and Paul goes over into this place, and we'll talk more. We're out of time, or Mary wouldn't have been tapping me so much. But look up Epicureanism if you get a chance. Read the chapter, look up Epicureanism, look up Stoicism, because you're going to see things that, I'll tell you a little about it, but you'll recognize them today, not only in society, but in a lot of our churches. God, we're always thankful, but still in the back of my mind, I have these places, I have these people that are about to get hit by a hurricane. We have these people who are trapped in a country, and some of them are already being punished, and more are going to be. And we're unsettled. We should feel peace. I'm unsettled. And it's a difficult thing. And Gene just talked to us about having, getting grace from you. God, we ask for the grace to be settled and to trust, but at the same time, to know that you know our hearts and you hear these prayers, and that you'll be present. I don't know how, but we always know after these disasters, there are opportunities for believers, for your people to step forward. And we know you don't bring bad things about for the opportunities, but we do know that you give us, each one of us, opportunities at times like these to step forward and show your grace, the grace that we've been given. Give us the reminders and give us the strength when that time comes to be the people who step forward. Amen.
Amen. You guys can unmute yourselves. Thank you, guys. I hope you all have a good week.
What?
Those philosophers were about 800 years coverage.
Yeah, it's about right. That's about right. Yeah.
So Laura and Jack, we see you down here next week, and hope you guys have a good week. And
Luis and Jack, John, I don't know, we lost visual on you, but it was good to see you today.
there's Anita. We haven't said.
Anita.
Yes, I've been here.
Thank
you.
Guys, have a good week.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. You gonna end the recording?